So my name is Susan Philpott, and I am a park ranger from Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which I have been informed is a little bit of an awkward name. Many of you might know it as the Sewell Belmont House. That was its name until 2016 when it became a National Park Service site. It's a 200-year-old house on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., at the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast, right by the Supreme Court. You can see from this picture, we kind of sit in the elbow of the Hart Senate office building, which is where a lot of protests happen often. But we are a site because for over 90 years, it was the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, founded by Alice Paul. And now it's a museum, and we tell stories about the work that the National Women's Party did over their time. And today I'm going to talk about the primary work that they did from that house, which they didn't move until 1929. So the primary work they did was working for the Equal Rights Amendment that we're going to talk about today. And this is a picture. Whoops, this is a picture from one of our museum cases. I'm not much of a photographer. You can see me in the reflection there, but some of the pins from over the years about the ERA. So this is the inside of the museum, although it's what it was up until recently. Right now it's undergoing a large renovation. So all of those busts and paintings that you see in the picture are now in storage. But we are hoping to welcome everybody back soon to a newly renovated space where we talk about women and the ongoing struggle for equality. And you can probably guess from this picture that the women who worked there and lived there were often giving honor to those who had come before. So you see those busts there, people like Susan B. Anthony, and not in this crowd, but if people know one name in the struggle for women's rights, they've heard of Susan B. Anthony, because she spent her entire life out on the road fighting for rights and justice, particularly the right to vote. And of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who stood here in the Wesleyan Chapel 175 years ago, calling people together to look at the issue specifically of women's rights and coming up with that Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And if you've walked down the wall out in the park there, you'll know that there were a lot of things on that Declaration of Sentiments detailing all of the ways that women were not treated equally. It was a long list in 1848. The one that they're kind of most known for is when Elizabeth Cady Stanton called for that resolution that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, the vote, which was, you know, the one issue that among these radical reformers seemed a little too crazy, women voting. Now that's just going too far. That's ridiculous. And eventually, they start to focus on the vote, that once you have the ballot, you have the power for the list of all of the other things. The story we tell at Belmont-Paul is the story of the next generations of women, particularly the National Women's Party founded by Alice Paul. They were the ones that were in your face. So they were kind of younger. The fight for the vote had been going on for decades, and there had been little bits of progress here and there. At the state level, women were winning either full suffrage or maybe the right to vote in school boards or local elections. And the reason that when you think of a suffragist, you see pictures of, say, women picketing at the White House. And by the way, I don't think the roller skater is part of the protest, but that would be awesome if she was, is because they were really good at being visible, you know, at getting pictures taken, about taking up space where women weren't supposed to be, standing at the White House gates with big bold banners that anybody walking by could read. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And my favorite, the young are at the gates. This idea that this is the new generation, the new women of the 20th century, and we are tired. We've had it. We don't want to hear the stories anymore about why we have to wait. We are demanding our rights. Now, I do have to say, the person who wrote that slogan, the young are at the gates, what is the potent spirit of youth? Is it not the spirit of revolt, of rebellion against useless and deadening things, most of all against injustice, which of all stupid things is the stupidest? That was Lavinia Dock. She was in her 60s when she wrote that. So being the young at the gates is not about chronicle age. It's about that willingness to think of new things, tread new paths, and stand up and think of new ways to do things. And they also said, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? So, as we all know, August of 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution ensuring that the right to vote could not be denied or abridged based on sex is ratified. Victory! This is Alice Paul toasting in front of the ratification banner where they've marked one state after another ratifying that amendment. I'm told it's grape juice because the nation was willing to ratify prohibition before women getting the vote. So celebration, right? They did it. 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, the women of this country had secured to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Time to celebrate. No. Alice Paul said, it's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality won. It has just begun. There's hardly a field, economic or political, in which the natural and unaccustomed policy is not to ignore women. Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically. What a downer. Where's our celebration? But Crystal Eastman also gave a famous speech in December of 1920 titled, Now We Can Begin. The vote's not the end, the vote's just beginning. Maybe this sentiment might sound prescient now. It says men are saying perhaps, thank God this everlasting woman's fight is over. But women, if I know them, are saying now at last we can begin. Now they can say what they are really after. And what they are after is freedom. So she didn't say equality, she said freedom. Liberty. Freedom is a large word. It is a large word. What does freedom mean? So, February 1921, Alice Paul plans another National Women's Party convention on Susan B. Anthony's birthday to say, okay, do we keep going or do we fold up? Do we say, all right, we wanted an amendment to the Constitution and franchising women, we're done? Or do we keep going? They have a big convention and they decide to keep going. There are people who are unhappy at that convention. They feel like Alice Paul really has already decided what she wants to do, and she's not listening to anybody else that's there. You have people like Florence Kelly, who's there and wants to talk about working women's issues and immigrant women's issues. You have Gertrude Bonin Sakalasa, who wants to talk about the Indian Citizenship Act, that Indigenous women don't have the vote because Indian women aren't considered citizens. And Mary Church Terrell, who is just constantly showing up to Alice Paul, no matter how often Alice Paul doesn't want to hear what she has to say. And Mary Church Terrell, who's an internationally known suffragist and civil rights advocate, wants to talk about the problem of Black women in the South, that they're facing the same violence and oppression that Black men are trying to vote. We need to talk about this. And Alice Paul doesn't really listen. She just decides, and she's not even really, so these are all areas that you could think maybe this is about freedom. What does freedom look like? The word Alice Paul wants to talk about is equality. And to Alice Paul, equality means if immigrant women are treated the same way as immigrant men, that's equality. If Black women are treated the same way as Black men, that's equality. Not freedom, really. But the first thing they decide to do is commission a statue remembering the pioneers of women's rights. So you might have noticed those busts that we have on display. Those are kind of the first drafts of the portrait monument that you'll see if you visit the Capitol. That was Alice Paul and the National Women's Party who commissioned Adelaide Johnson to make that. They gave it to the Congress, and the Congress stuck it in the basement in the crypt. That was sort of the response to this. Is this going to be a new age of women in political life? That was probably a sign that probably not. And then they got to work trying to figure out, okay, now women have the vote. Now what? And so the NWP legal team took a count of all the ways that women are treated differently under the law all across the country. They were led by Bernita Shelton Matthews, who would later become a federal judge, and by the way, a mentor to a young lawyer named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it was a long list, as you can imagine. And so they saw they had a big job in front of them if they're talking about equality. So they went back to that Declaration of Sentiments. And they said, okay, let's see what they were talking about in 1848 and where are we in 1922? And if you read their Declaration of Principles, it's not much different. In fact, it starts out, whereas women today, although enfranchised, are still in every way subordinate to men before the law. In government, in educational opportunities, in the professions, in the church, in industry, and in the home. So there's a cartoon by their cartoonist Nina Allender that shows modern women with their vote and the spirit of Susan B. Anthony pointing at the Bill of Rights and saying everything but the vote is still to be won. So at first they figure, well, rather than trying to pick these laws off one at a time, which they did, what we need is comprehensive federal legislation that declares women's equality across the country. They just won the vote. The politicians are at this point, sort of, willing to listen to women. So they're not standing out at the White House gates anymore. Now they're invited inside to meet with President Harding and get a photo op. We want this comprehensive legislation, and that doesn't really go anywhere. So 100 years ago yesterday, they come here to Seneca Falls. They meet at the First Presbyterian Church around the corner because at the time this is a garage. And they hold a convention where they unveil their intention to amend the Constitution again. This time not for the vote, but for full equality. And a group of large group of people recreated this photograph last night over at the First Presbyterian Church. I mentioned that our site is called the Belmont-Paul, and I've talked about Alice Paul. I haven't mentioned Alva Belmont. She was the one who made all of this work, all of these ideas of Alice Paul a reality because she was the person with the money. That's Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. I wasn't actually sure how involved she was with the Equal Rights Amendment. I need to do some more research because she got involved in international women's rights and moved to Europe, but she was here. Let's see, that's her. That's Alva right there. I saw that when I was in the church last night. I said, oh, that's Alva was here too. So they had this convention and they announced this amendment with big fanfare, with a huge pageant. And these are local dancers from Seneca Falls. Now, unfortunately, I only have pictures of the rehearsals, not of the actual event. And that is too bad. Because apparently there was a grand parade, trumpets, lots of banners, that's still big on the banners, about 500 banners, and about 1,000 performers of women, some of them dressed as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but others as sort of historical sense of the accomplishments of women, the burden bearers, the tillers of the soil. And then there were barges out there on the water, and at dark, a huge display in flashing electric lights saying Declaration of Principles. So that must have been quite a spectacle here in Seneca Falls 100 years ago. And Alice Paul, as she announces this, says, if we keep on this way, so hitting one law at a time, little by little, they will be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 1848 convention without being much further advanced in equal rights than we are. We shall not be safe until the principle of equal rights is written into the framework of our government. I don't know if anybody was here for the 150th anniversary of the 1848 convention 25 years ago, but here we are at the 175th. And how far advanced are we? Good question. But that was when they said, okay, we are announcing the Lucretia Mott Amendment. So they were really choosing Lucretia Mott as one of the forebearers of this cause of women's equality. This idea that those who were calling for the vote have been calling for equality since even before the Women's Rights Convention. And that amendment had a little bit different wording. It said, men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and in every place subject to its jurisdiction. So two things you see there. First is that men are there, right? Equal rights for all. And the second is that every place subject to its jurisdiction. That would have made it apply in the territories, which say the 19th Amendment didn't. So women in Puerto Rico still didn't have the right to vote. Women in the Philippines, women in the US territories. This one's covering everything, covering everybody and covering everything. And they get to work. Now, they don't start, even though they had a big spectacle here, they don't start with big spectacles. They start with getting politicians on board, and they get that amendment written into a joint resolution in December of that year, so pretty quickly. 1923, it's introduced by Daniel Reed Anthony from Kansas, who is the nephew of Susan B. Anthony, and Charles Curtis in the Senate, who would later go on to be the first vice president of indigenous ancestry. And he was a great supporter of women's equality too. So it gets introduced, and so then they have hearings. And when they have hearings, it turns out nobody but the National Women's Party thinks this is a good idea. Of particular significance, and those who are against the idea of this amendment are some of the best known suffragists. Now, we talk about the National Women's Party, and those are the ones we see the pictures of, but the National Women's Suffrage Organization was much larger, much better funded, and had been doing the work for decades and decades. They had at this point become the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters doesn't think this amendment is a good idea. Part of that is because the two women you see labeled, Carrie Chapman Catt and Maud Wood Park, are not fans of Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. They don't like the way they do things, don't think that they have good ideas, think they're kind of made the suffrage movement look ridiculous, don't want to be associated with them at all. But also there are real concerns. what do you mean by equal rights? What does that look like? Alice Paul, what she hears is the problem is that women have internalized their unequal status, their inferiority. And she said, so this was from an interview she gave, and she was elderly in the 70s, but she said, so then we saw that our problem would not be the Senate and Congress and the president, because now we were voters and had the power. It will be changing the thought of the American woman. That was her idea, that the problem is that women just don't see how important it is that they be treated equally. But you know, there are people with real concerns, and they say Alice Paul isn't listening. One of the ways that women have made real strides is in protective labor legislation. So women in the workplace facing very dangerous conditions, facing assault, facing issues with caring for their homes, because of course they're required to do that too, have made strides with getting protective labor legislation, which the Supreme Court has said is okay because the state has an interest in women's bodies. So it's okay to have legislation that protects women, but not men. Now, those who support the Equal Rights Amendment say, what you don't realize is that when you say that women need protection that men don't have, that what you're saying is that women are inferior. And this is an example of one of their political cartoons about that, what the sign reads that this young mother is looking at says, protection. Motherhood is the noblest profession in the world. Therefore, you must be given the inferior jobs, the lowest pay, and your hours of work shall be limited except in the home. So this is the argument that those who support the Equal Rights Amendment are saying. You know, what you're seeing as protection, as giving you the ability to work, is actually limiting you. Now, they did have some publicity stunts for the Equal Rights Amendment. This is a convoy rushing out to meet President Coolidge on Valentine's Day. The Equal Rights envoy showing up to convince him to support the Equal Rights Amendment. But mostly what they did was that kind of slow process of trying to get political change. They had become expert lobbyers. I love this photo of them. All have gotten their lobby assignments and they're heading up to the Hill to lobby. And so they're saying, you know, we're voters, so we have that voice through our vote. We're going to convince legislatures to pass this amendment. They kept very meticulous lobbying records, and this is an example of the kind of responses that they got. This is a card from their interview with a New Hampshire senator who said he thinks it's a fool amendment. He's through putting embroidery in the Constitution. So this idea that, all right, look, ladies, you can vote, but these other things you're talking about, they're just frivolous. They don't belong in our founding document. You don't belong there. So they kind of give up on him. You notice the date on this is June 6, 1929. What happens a few months later? The stock market crash. The nation is plunged into the Great Depression. And what happens during the Great Depression is a lot of animosity towards women in the workplace, right? Because women are out there taking jobs that men should have. So there's legislation passed to try and get women out of the workforce, kind of at the state level. And then there is a federal law, Section 213 of the Economic Act of 1932, that barred two family members from working for the federal government at the same time. When that law was originally proposed, it was to ban married women in the workplace. They changed it this way to say you can't have two family members. The idea, if you have both a husband and a wife working for the federal government, it's the wife who's going to be making less, and so she's probably the one who's going to give up her job. So it's a way to get women out of the federal workforce. The National Women's Party in their campaign against it urged married women to get a divorce rather than give up their job. But the law passed and it isn't repealed until 1937. I'm so glad they kept fighting as someone who works in the federal government. But that's the sort of thing that you're seeing in the 30s. In addition, very prominent women in FDR's government don't support the Equal Rights Amendment. Eleanor Roosevelt says she thinks it's kind of foolish. Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member, the Secretary of Labor, is worried about what it's going to do for women in the workforce. So without that kind of support in the 30s, and as the nation is heading towards war, not a lot happens in the ERA. I should mention that I am covering 100 years of history. So I'm just hitting some high points. I may not mention your favorite part of the story or your favorite person. I'd love to talk about that later, but we're just going to hit a few more high points. And you have people like former suffragists who are prominent attorney Dorothy Strauss showing up to testify against the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's that certainly sends the message to people who are opposed to it. Look, women don't even want this. So it doesn't really go anywhere. Until, oh, and this is, you know, I don't have pictures of like the National Women's Party storming the gates, trying to be transgressive and win this battle for this amendment. What they're doing, you know, this is at the New York World's Fair. They have a booth. And that's important. You know, it's important to show up and get things in people's minds. But it doesn't seem like they're the young at the gates anymore in the same way. Alice Paul, on her part, is going to law school because she's getting all these legal reasons why the Equal Rights Amendment is not a good idea. So she decides she needs to learn everything she can about the law. Even though she already has a PhD in political science, she gets her JD in law. And because of that, and because of her discussions with politicians that are on their sides, they changed the wording. And so this is the version of the ERA that you probably are familiar with. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That change happens in 1943. You might notice two things. One is it's not about what has to happen, but about what can't happen. And secondly, we've lost in every area subject to its jurisdiction. So it's just in states. It wouldn't apply in territories. But by the next year, both the Republican and Democratic Party have added the Equal Rights Amendment to their platform. So they're making progress, particularly as you have women in the workforce throughout the war, just like women kind of won the vote after World War I. They're getting more support after World War II and during World War II. And in 1950, the amendment passes the Senate with more than its needed 2/3 majority, except it's got some added wording on it. It says the provisions of this article shall not be construed to impair any rights, benefits, or exemptions now or hereafter conferred by law upon persons of the female sex. So basically equality of rights under the law, except when we write laws that treat women differently. And so the people who've been fighting so long for this Equal Rights Amendment say, well, no. That's the opposite of equality. Catherine St. George, representative from New York, who's been fighting to get the amendment out of the Judiciary Committee, gives up after this because she doesn't want it to pass, or stops fighting, at least for the time being, with this rider attached to it, because that's basically defeating the purpose. You notice it's called the Hayden Rider. It was added by this guy, Senator Carl Hayden of Arizona. And when he was asked, why did you add this? He said, well, in the beginning, God made them different when male and female created he them. So, you know, I mean, equality, really? Women are just different. They're different biologically, they're different by divine order. So you can't really have equality. And that's a lot of the kind of argument that you see against the Equal Rights Amendment. But, you know, it's not the only argument. Holly Murray, who is an incredible fighter for equality and justice. She organized cafeteria sit-ins in the 1940s, way before the Greensboro lunch counters. She was arrested not giving up her seat on a bus before Rosa Parks. She coined the term Jane Crow to sort of give it a sense of the things that Black women face when they're both discriminated against because of race and sex. So she's a big fighter for equality. She is the one who has come up with the legal strategy that civil rights lawyers should fight to, and not just to oppose segregation based on the fact that these separate conditions are unequal, but that segregation is in its essence unconstitutional. And she bases that argument on the 14th Amendment's protection for equal protection and due process. And so what she says about the Equal Rights Amendment is that our equality is already in the 14th Amendment. And if you start adding another amendment, that's going to take away our argument that we already have equality under the 14th Amendment. So she says in a letter to the National Women's Party, we differ not so much on our objectives as in our strategy. So is the ERA the right way to go about getting equality? She doesn't think so. In 1961, John F. Kennedy calls a commission on the status of women. It's headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, although Eleanor Roosevelt dies the next year. Eleanor Roosevelt at this point is still not quite sure about the ERA. She can see the arguments for it, but there's nobody on the commission that's a strong supporter of the ERA. Nobody from the National Women's Party joins because they already know, they say, what the response is going to be. And when the report is given in 1963, it does list all sorts of things, like that Declaration of Sentiments, like the Declaration of Principles, all sorts of things that need to change. But they say, since the commission is convinced that the U.S. Constitution now embodies equality of rights for men and women, we conclude that a constitutional amendment need not now be sought in order to establish this principle. So they go with it. It's already in the 14th Amendment. So that's disappointing for those fighting for the ERA. And then the next year, of course, what's happening in the 1960s? What are people really focusing on is this huge movement for civil rights. And a great triumph of that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in which there is a word added into Title VII when it has to do with employment, that there can be no discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. Now, you might have heard in your history classes that this is in there because of people who oppose the Civil Rights Act, and it was supposed to be a poison pill, that of course nobody's going to vote for equality in employment based on sex. That's partially true. That was added by this guy, Representative Howard Smith, Democrat from Virginia, who was absolutely opposed to desegregation, hated the Civil Rights Act, and maybe wanted that in there for that reason, thinking it would kill it. But it's also championed by people who are championing women's equality. And Howard Smith did actually support women's equality, at least white women. So here's a picture of some champions of women's equality standing with Howard Smith, Representative Martha Griffith, and Representative Catherine St. George from New York, who have been advocates. So women have to be treated equally in the workplace. Sets up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that's supposed to be enforcing this. And what women like Sonia Pressman Fuentes, who's an attorney there, discover is that the EEOC is not interested in enforcing this law when it comes to sex. They're only enforcing it based on race. And that gets very frustrating. And as a result of trying to get the EEOC to start enforcing this part of the law, the National Organization for Women is founded in 1966. So here's a picture from the National Organization for Women. I have a great story of Alice Paul, who by this point is elderly, showing up at the second annual conference of the National Organization for Women. She and other NWP members, who at this point are mostly very elderly, they are no longer the young at the gates. They have not been recruiting new generations of people into their organization. They are there to try and get the National Organization for Women to take up the ERA as part of their platform. And this is controversial. There are lots of labor unions involved in now, and they are still not sure about the ERA. But now is sort of the beginning of what becomes this new second wave of feminists. Many of them have worked in the civil rights movement, or they've been marching against the Vietnam War, and they start to use those kind of controversial, transgressive, in your face tactics to fight for their rights, and not just for rights, but what they call liberation. How long must women wait for liberty? Our word is freedom. They don't just want equality of rights under the law. They want to be treated as equal persons. So one of my favorite demonstrations is at the Miss America pageant, where they have a freedom trash can on the boardwalk there in Atlantic City. They're protesting unequal or unreasonable standards of beauty as an oppression of women. And they throw in the objects of their oppression, like hair curlers and fashion magazines and bras. You notice they are not setting them on fire. Bra burners was kind of a derogatory term that was thrown at them, but they didn't actually burn. But this new generation of women, the new young at the gates, they are fighting for equality and justice, and they are taking up the ERA too. So it's got new energy behind it. And in 1972, it passes. March 22nd, 1972. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. It doesn't have the Hayden Rider in it anymore, but it has something else. I met somebody who told me a story about coming over from the Capitol to the National Women's Party headquarters to meet Alice Paul and celebrate with her that the ERA had finally passed. And Alice Paul was in tears and not of joy because of that paragraph before, because they put a time limit on ratification of 7 years. Till 3/4 of the states ratify it. And Alice Paul said, that's going to kill it. I'm paraphrasing what this person told me, but that she said, they're sending the message that all the opponents have to do is wait it out and the ERA will go away. Now, at first, it seems like that's not going to be a problem. There are states, Hawaii ratifies the same day. Within a few months, there are one state after another ratifying the amendment. And then 1973, Roe versus Wade. It seems like it's a new era for women. And I should mention that this movement has bipartisan support. You know, we have Patsy Mink, Democratic representative from Hawaii, who's the champion of the ERA, but also First Lady Betty Ford, or she becomes First Lady soon after this, who's a supporter of the ERA too. It seems like, you know, I remember the first time I read those words on the walls of our museum. Who could argue with equality of rights under the law, right? Seems like it's going to be ratified, no problem. But there are still people who are concerned. This is Myra Wolfgang, a labor leader and women's rights activist. And she says, baby, basically, it's not, our opposition is not whether women should be discriminated against, but what constitutes discrimination. We who want equal opportunities, equal pay for equal work, and equal status for women know that frequently we obtain real equality through a difference in treatment rather than an identity in treatment. Now, those who support the ERA are always arguing, you know, if your issue is that that women are facing certain problems in the workplace, then you should fix those problems in the workplace, not by treating men and women differently, but by dealing with that problem. If the issue is childcare, then deal with childcare. If the issue is violence against women, then deal with violence against women. And what the opponents are saying is that you're going to put this in the Constitution and get rid of all of those protections before we have solved those problems. So that's where it stands. And of course, it's not just people who are worried about that. Now, there are lots of people who oppose the ERA. This person is the one who's best known. She's kind of the poster child for the opposition. This is Phyllis Schlafly. Now, interestingly, I was just reading a book called Jesus and John Wayne, which is about the rise of kind of the conservative movement in evangelical services circles, and mentioned that Phyllis Schlafly didn't really care about the ERA one way or the other when it first came out. She said, that sounds fine. But eventually she starts to see the ERA as kind of the poster, that the symbol that she's going to hold up for all the things she does oppose. And so she starts having campaigns. She's brilliant at political strategy, at making people angry and making people afraid. She's probably the original troll, but she's bringing up things that people really are worried about. Like, what will this mean for women in combat? What does this mean for people who are pregnant? What does this mean about bathrooms? So it's a bathroom issue, right? But she's saying this is going to make it so that women who aren't in the workforce are going to lose their protections. I just want to point out that you notice where these protesters are? They are picketing the White House. They're using Alice Paul's own innovative strategy against her amendment. And Alice Paul fought for that amendment up until her last breath. This is a picture of her being interviewed in the nursing home. And you notice she's got the ERA, a pin and blanket on her lap. So she got to see the amendment passed, and she got to see it starting to have support, and then she saw the backlash. Alice Paul died July 9th of 1977. And on Women's Equality Day that year, there was an equal rights march, an Alice Paul memorial march that went from our headquarters from Belmont-Paul up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And a huge march, purple, white, and gold suffrage banners. And so, and the next year, or later that year, I'm sorry, there's this huge event in Houston, the International Women's Conference. And the way it starts with runners started from here, from Seneca Falls with a torch, and ran all the way to Houston. This is a picture of them marching into Houston. Last night, actually, I saw Catherine Switzer, who was the first woman to run in the Boston Marathon. She was here wearing her original official runner's shirt. And so they opened this conference. This is going to be, it's federally funded. It's going to be setting the agenda for women. Except Phyllis Schlafly held a conference in the city at the same time. And it made it clear that when you start talking about half of the population, that not everybody has the same idea of what that looks like. Women are as varied as men, and they have as different political views as men. And that really is the beginning of the end of the support for the Equal Rights Amendment and the beginning of the backlash. So the next year, on the 1-year anniversary of Alice Paul's death, there's a huge march in Washington, D.C., marching on the Capitol this time, trying to get Congress to extend the time limit. So it's 1978, they're coming up on that time limit in March of 1979 really quickly. They don't think they're going to be able to get enough states. They want Congress to extend the time limit. I just want to point out there's, in this picture is Elizabeth Holtzman from New York. And then also I am from Maryland, and that's Barbara Mikulski from Maryland there. That's Dick Gregory. Yeah, the comedian, civil rights advocate, and supporter of women's rights. You probably also see Gloria Steinem there. That's Susan Sarandon, the kind of young Susan Sarandon marching in the back. It works. They get 3 more years. President Carter signs the legislation that passed that gives them 3 more years. But no more states ratify the amendment. So by 1982, everybody just thinks the ERA is dead. Not everybody, of course. Immediately, there are members of Congress who are just every year introducing the ERA back into Congress again. And there's lots of things, of course, that happened after 1982, or I'm not going to go over all of them, but suddenly, oh, this is, sorry, I forgot this. The ERA won't go away, but it went away, it looked like. Except that there's a new women's movement beginning in 2017. And after the Women's March, Nevada ratifies the Equal Rights Amendment. All of a sudden, everybody's talking about the ERA again. So this is an old map. It says only 2 more states are needed to ratify the ERA. Then Illinois, Phyllis Schlafly State, ratifies the ERA. And then in January of 2020, Virginia ratifies the ERA. Yes. So that's it. We've got all the states we need, right? Except on this map that I got from Business Insider, you can see that some states said they rescind their ratification. Now there's definitely a question about whether you can do that. But also there's that time limit. And we've seen, as I've been talking about today, there's a lot of discussion about what happens with that time limit. Here's a picture of 2 proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment. You might be surprised that I said that. You probably know Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, was a big supporter of the ERA, and whatever equality women have that's recognized in the Constitution is probably because of lawsuits that Ruth Bader Ginsburg brought. She was a great supporter of it. Next to her is her friend Antonin Scalia. They were friends, although they disagreed about just about everything. Well, why do I say that Antonin Scalia was a proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment? Because in this interview, he said, certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. And he says it doesn't. Now, both of those Supreme Court justices have passed away, but in the Supreme Court and in the judiciary, there are lots of people who follow their line of thinking. And there's lots of people on the Supreme Court who agree with Antonin Scalia that right now the Constitution does not require discrimination, does not prohibit discrimination based on sex. So we probably don't have this question here, but a lot of times at Belmont-Paul, when I'm talking to visitors, they'll ask, well, why do we need the ERA anymore? Don't women have equality now? Well, what does equality of rights under the law look like in 2023, 100 years after it was introduced? This is a picture from the 2018 Women's March. You can see some of those issues that people are holding up. If you were to have a march today, I'm sure there would be even more things. So if we were to make our own declaration of sentiments, our own declaration of principles today, what would we put on it? And would it look like equality and liberation? So thank you so much for your time, everybody. And I would love to answer any questions you might have. I know we don't have much time because I talk too long, but if there's any stories you'd like to tell or questions I can answer, I can do it now and I can do it afterwards outside if we're to move on to the next speaker.